Right now, we're in the worst possible situation. And between 3,000 and 4,000 deaths per day.
Tonight, hope resting on that vaccine.
The coronavirus vaccine.
Across the country, hope that this is a game changer.
But no vaccine will be effective if the people don't take it.
A lot of people are very fearful of the vaccine.
I don't know that I'm gonna take it. I don't even take the flu shot.
I've heard a lot of crazy things.
This vaccine can alter your DNA. It's too close to the mark of the beast.
Dr. Fauci, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question.
Yeah, let me just chime in here.
What potential side effects do we need to worry about? Why should the American people trust this vaccine? Welcome to Conversations with America, a data-driven vehicle for helping Americans navigate uncomfortable discussions. I'm Bishop T.D. Jakes, and I'm proud to be your host today. For the last 10 months, we've been living through the worst pandemic in more than a century. I'm sure you're familiar with the numbers. More than 22 million infected and 360,000 people are dead. These are numbers that continue to rise daily. It is rare that a household has not been touched in some way by the pandemic, whether through infection, job loss, or the death of a relative or a close friend. We've all been touched. Thankfully, help appears to be on the horizon. The federal government has approved multiple vaccines for use. Scientists tell us they are more than 90% effective. But the question remains, will you take it? Recent polls suggest that many Americans either won't take it or are still on the fence for a variety of reasons. This is a question many are having around the dinner table. Recently, we conducted a focus group online just a few days ago, in fact. We reached nearly 700,000 of you and got approximately 300,000 views. More than 21,000 of you sent me questions. We've invited some of the best in the medical field to address some of these questions and to separate fiction from fact. Our guests are my personal physician, Dr. Jill Waggoner, an integrative medicine expert and author who's been named the magazine's best doctor for 3 consecutive years. Dr. Waggoner will be my co-host today. Dr. Ogbuagu, an infectious disease specialist, an associate professor at Yale School of Medicine, who led Yale's COVID-19 clinical studies. He is the principal investigator of the Pfizer COVID-19 trial at the Yale Center for Clinical Investigation. Also joining us is Dr. Kizzy Corbett, a viral immunologist with the National Institute of Health's Vaccine Research Center, where she is the scientific lead for coronavirus research. Her work focuses on developing novel coronavirus vaccines, including mRNA-1273, a leading vaccine candidate against the coronavirus. And finally, a man who has been affectionately dubbed America's doctor in this ongoing battle against COVID-19. For nearly 40 years, Dr. Anthony Fauci has served as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institute of Health. He is one of the world's leading immunology scholars and has advised 6 presidents. Dr. Corbett, I'm going to start with you. This vaccine was developed in 9 months. Walk us through the development and the precautions that were taken. What are some of the steps you would have ordinarily taken that you didn't hear, and why should the American people trust this vaccine?
You know, the vaccine was developed before the American people's eyes in 9 months, but the work that went into the vaccine development has been happening for several years, even up to 15 years, even since the first SARS coronavirus started over a decade ago. And so there was a large amount of reference as far as data and preclinical work that happened even prior to this pandemic. And I think it's really good to really highlight that. And as far as this particular vaccine, actually today marks the date of which we woke up and saw the sequences online for the virus for SARS-CoV-2, and really got to work. And although it's so-called warp speed, there have not been any particular parts of vaccine development that have been skipped along the process. We have a full portfolio of preclinical data surrounding these vaccines, as well as phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials for these vaccine development. So what you're seeing is not just a large amount of work that went into it previously, but also as this development has been happening, really a very concerted effort to make sure the job got done, but without any steps being missed.
Do you have any angst in the fact that you've not been able to evaluate long-term outcomes from the vaccine, or are you fairly comfortable that over long term we should have no major complications from it?
No, absolutely no angst at all. You know, one of the things that I think is largely forgotten throughout this is that the first phase 1 clinical trial actually started on March the 16th, which was almost 10 months ago. And so from those people, they've been followed since then, and there are no outcomes for long-term adverse outcomes. And so what you're seeing here is something that not only has previous vaccine development showed us, but as we're collecting data, it's very clear that long-term side effects are not something to be worried about. Dr. Fauci has said several times over and over that historically side effects happen within the first 2 months of vaccine development. And that's exactly what you're seeing here as well.
Dr. Ogbuagu, let me direct this question toward you. A recent poll showed that the share of Black Americans planning to get the vaccine has increased somewhat to 25% since September, but it's still at only 50%. What can you and your peers do to improve the level of trust people of color have in the health system overall, and with this particular vaccine in particular?
Yeah, so Bishop Jake, that's always very concerning, especially because we know that the data clearly shows that racial ethnic minorities have worse outcomes with COVID-19. And so you would, it's disheartening that the group that disproportionately impacted are not at least disproportionately interested in receiving the vaccine. There's really no one approach to this, and no one pathway to improving it. First of all, also celebrating that more people are definitely reporting an increased desire to receive the vaccine. So, I think we need to address some of the principal concerns that have borne out both in research studies and public polls. Some concerns revolve around the accelerated pace of trials, like Dr. Corbett was mentioning, the perception that corners were cut. Obviously, we've repeated this about just the historical issues around injustices around the way clinical trials are conducted and how it's perceived by the Black community. There are concerns about side effects as well. There's lots of circulating misconceptions and misinformation and disinformation on social media overall. So I think that there are a couple of things that can be done. I think messaging from trusted messengers, and it's great to have Dr. Fauci here, who has really been a national resource on this. Consistent messaging is also critical from respected authorities, the CDC, FDA, public health authorities that people look up to, and also really working on what some people have called vaccine literacy, and really just finding ways to communicate in language that people understand within the appropriate cultural context to get that message out about the role that vaccines play in public health to control diseases and eradicate epidemics. And I also hope, I think one of the factors definitely that has impacted the willingness to receive a vaccine also is just really people watching others receive the vaccine. I received my vaccine publicly. I think Dr. Corbett and Dr. Fauci have done the same. And individuals who people identify as role models in the community, I think that has also played a great role in having people be just a little more comfortable with receiving the vaccine. And I hope that number will continue to tick up.
Dr. Ogbuagu, I wanted to follow up with the question. You jump right in whenever you want to, but I wanted to follow up with the question. We've heard a lot of discussion about pre-existing illnesses and conditions and how the virus reacts to pre-existing conditions. Should we have any kind of concern as it relates to pre-existing conditions in terms of the vaccine? We've heard some things about allergies and so forth. I don't know whether to interpret that as whether you're allergic to pollen in the air, or whether it's allergies to certain types of medicine. Should we be worried, particularly people of color, but people in general, with pre-existing illnesses as it relates to the vaccine?
Yeah, so Bishop Bakes, it became very apparent very early on that certain individuals who had worse outcomes with COVID had certain characteristics. So this include things like obesity, other medical conditions, diabetes, lung conditions, and the list goes on and on. And one of the reasons why Blacks, African Americans, especially, one of the reasons why we think they're having worse outcomes is because of the prevalence of these comorbidities among those populations. And so, as you can expect in the clinical trials, there was a good representation of individuals with some of these medical comorbidities. In the Pfizer vaccine trial, for example, which I participated in, about 35% were obese, for example. There was quite a decent proportion that had hypertension. I think diabetes was about 8%. And the study results, really show that this was robust efficacy even among individuals who have these underlying conditions. And also a point on elderly individuals as well. So, elderly individuals tend to have less immune responses to vaccines. And it was really nice to see that in the Pfizer trial, and also to some degree, same in the Moderna trial, that older individuals had a decent amount of protection against COVID-19 in spite of some of these vulnerabilities like you mentioned. And then the last thing you alluded to was allergies. And I know that there was a lot of this in the press around some of the severe allergies, or anaphylaxis, which is a very severe form of allergy that can be life-threatening and that occurs very quickly after people receive vaccines. Again, these tend to occur in people who have a history of similar things, anaphylaxis or severe allergies. That's borne out in even the captured events in the vaccine event reporting system. So again, I think the warning has been gone out that those with severe allergies, the anaphylaxis kind especially, should definitely be cautious around receiving the vaccine. And wherever the vaccines are offered, they're typically in sites. The sites are known to have some of the emergency medications that you need so that to mitigate some of these side effects in individuals. So these are not routine allergies like spring allergies and things like that, which are a little more common. This is just the minority of the individuals. I think the last data I heard on the frequency of occurrence of some of these severe anaphylactoid type reactions was about 6 in a million doses or so. So it's really, really rare.
Very rare.
One of the things that, of course, we hear all of the information and we're listening just like everybody else is. And as Bishop said, he had the opportunity to do the live and we got lots of feedback. One of the questions was, you talked about the diversity of conditions and that kind of thing, but what was the racial diversity in the clinical trial? What did that look like?
I don't want to do all the talking, but yes, I'll just make a few points about that. I think there was a lot of press halfway through enrollment, particularly of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which were kind of like the lead or first candidates out there with the large phase 3 trials. And midway through, there was this alarm that there was insufficient enrollment of racial ethnic minorities. Now, let me just be clear, again, sharing my clinical trials experience, that it can be challenging, frankly, to enroll racial ethnic minorities in clinical research. And I think some of the issues that fuel vaccine hesitancy also fuel that reluctance to participate in clinical trials and clinical research. But there was a lot of effort in the clinical trials to boost or optimize the enrollment of ethnic racial minorities, such things as site selection, so selecting clinical trial sites where there was a diverse population that could be reached, adjustments to enrollment processes, and of course, outreach to communities of color to get them more engaged in clinical research. So, some of the fruits of that were that for the Moderna trial, for example, 10% were Black, about 20% were Hispanic, 4.5% or so were Asian. So that really comes to about 35% of the population, the study clinical trial population being racial and ethnic minorities. Pfizer, I think, was about 28% Hispanic, 9% Black, 4% Asian. So, frankly, those numbers I would have liked to see higher, but I think enough to be able to adjudicate the results in those racial ethnic groups.
Yeah, let me just chime in there. It really is very important. We put a lot of effort with the Moderna trial. Literally every Saturday at 10 o'clock, we would meet with the leaders of the trial to encourage them to go the extra mile to get minorities involved in the trial, because not only do you want to make sure that it is safe and effective in all the demographic groups, particularly those who have a higher incidence of severe outcomes, which is brown and Black people, for sure, for a number of reasons. We've got to get them represented, because you want to be able to look at your community of individuals in the minority demographic group and say, we've actually tested the vaccine in you, and it is safe and it's effective in you. Therefore, you should feel comfortable that we're not just doing it in people who we think the vaccine is going to be used for. Right now, as was just mentioned, we got up to 10% of African Americans. I would have liked to have seen it get up to the 13%, which is the proportion demographically of African Americans. We did okay with Latinx. We got it up to 21%, and 18% of the population in this country is Latino and Latina. I think we should do even more, and I'm certain that Dr. Ogbuagu feels exactly the same as me. You want to get it to the level that the disease impacts in society. And if you look at African Americans, the rate of hospitalizations per 100,000 and the number of deaths per 100,000 is disproportionate among African Americans and Latinx. So we really even need to do better in clinical trials. And that's the reason why we keep pushing to get people involved. But the distrust in the community is understandable. So you've got to address each and every one of the concerns that they have. Kizzy gave a very good explanation to the answer of why was it so quick? Was it cutting corners? And it wasn't. It was years and years of science. When people ask me, well, how do you know it's safe and effective? Are they trying to put something over on us? Is this the federal government trying to fool you again? Remember Tuskegee? Or what about the efficacy? Is it really 94 to 95% efficacious? And the answer is that the decision about whether or not it's safe and effective is made by independent bodies, data and safety monitoring boards that don't answer to the government and don't answer to the company. They're independent groups made up of scientists and statisticians and immunologists. They make the determination. Then when they say it's okay, it goes to the FDA, and the career scientists at the FDA make that determination, but they do it again in collaboration with their own advisory committee. So we could look the African American population in the face and say the whole process was both transparent and independent. And we have to keep making that very, very clear, because we have to respect the skepticism in the African American population about federal government medical programs. You can't walk away from that. It's a shameful history that we have to just deal with. So whenever I talk to my African American friends and colleagues about getting vaccinated, you always have to show respect for their skepticism and then try to get them to understand why it is safe, it is effective, and it is good not only for your own health, but for your families and your community.
Dr. Fauci, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question. One of the, we exposed the questions to about 700,000 people via social media and got some of our questions from there. One of the concerns that came up is even after you've had the first shot of the vaccine and the second one, We are told that you still have to wear a mask. If you still have to wear a mask after you have cleared and it's got 95% efficacy, could you address the purpose of continuing to wear a mask? And is there ever going to be a point that we can go back to quote unquote normal, if there be such a thing?
Well, Bishop, I believe we will get back to some form of normality, but that would be really dependent on the percentage of people in our society who get vaccinated. But let me answer your first question, which is a very relevant and appropriate question. One wears a mask for two reasons. One, in case you are infected and have no symptoms and don't even know you're infected, that you would not then transmit it to someone else. Number two, there is also evidence that it could protect you from getting infected. So having said that, when you get vaccinated, even though the vaccine may be 94 to 95% effective, there are two aspects of that that you need to understand. A, you may be one of the people that is not protected. And B, we know that the vaccine prevents you from experiencing clinically recognizable disease. We don't know yet whether it prevents you from getting infected in an asymptomatic way. So it is entirely conceivable, and we will get the answer to this sometime, but we don't have it now, that when you get protected from getting sick, which is the primary endpoint of the trial, preventing clinically recognizable disease, you could still get infected and have virus in your nasopharynx without your even realizing it. So even though you're not getting sick, you may be shedding virus. And that's the reason why we still want people to wear masks. Now, the answer to your question about when will we in society feel comfortable that we don't have to be so stringent in our public health measures, that's when you get a veil or a blanket of protection over society that we call herd immunity. Namely, so many people are vaccinated or have been previously infected that the virus doesn't have any place to go. It's looking for vulnerable people and they're not around because most people are protected. If we get 70 to 85% of the population vaccinated, then we could feel comfortable that we have probably very close to herd immunity. But until that time, we don't want people to get the impression that just because we're vaccinating people, that we don't have to worry about public health measures. We have to continue to implement them until society is relatively free of this virus.
What will be the indicators that we're at a good spot? How will we know that we've hit that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It will be the percent positive in the population of people, and it will be the degree of new cases. For example, right now, we're in the worst possible situation. We're averaging between 200,000 and 300,000 new infections a day and between 3,000 and 4,000 deaths per day. So you don't need to be a genius to figure out that we're not there right now. But as soon as those level of infections go way, way, way down, then you know you're in that safe zone.
What about access to the vaccine? I'm hearing a lot on the news about we're getting the vaccine, but we're not getting vaccinated because the access has not been worked out. Can you give us any precursor information about distribution and what you have planned to make the vaccine available more readily for people, especially people, homeless people, oppressed communities, neighborhoods where they don't even have grocery stores? What are we going to do about distribution? It seems to be a huge deterrent. The numbers have been far less than was originally projected. What are your thoughts about that going forward?
Well, very good point. Let me start off by the outset to say there's no excuses for that. We need to do better. You always have to admit that. There are multiple aspects of getting vaccine. There's the discovery. That's what Kizzy was involved with. Then there's the production, which is what the company does. Then there's the allocation, the shipping, the distribution, and then finally getting the vaccine into people's arms. And each of those things have a a process by which you do that. The original process was to distribute 20 million doses for 20 million people, keeping the 20 million for the second dose, and getting it into people's arms by the end of December. Obviously, we didn't do that. We distributed 13 to 14 million, and at first we only got 2 to 3 million. Now we're up to 7 million in people's arms. We wanted to get 20 million. I believe that the reason for that is that this was a brand new process of an unprecedented challenge of trying to vaccinate so many people. So there's going to be bumps in the road and hiccups. Right now, I would give it another week or two to see if we could get back online. If not, we've got to make sure that our restriction to certain priority groups is not getting in the way of getting it more diffusely out. And one of the things we absolutely need to do is we got to make sure that we have multiple ways of getting it distributed, because if you do it only one way, is a big danger of excluding the people that we're all worried about. The poor people who don't have access, the people who live in areas where pharmacies are not readily accessible, the people who live in situations where they don't have access to health care. The way we're going to get around that is put it in community centers in the community where you have African-American demographically dominating the population, as opposed to just getting people vaccinated without paying attention to an equitable distribution right from the get-go. That's going to be a big challenge, but we know what we need to do with that.
Is there any thought about getting medical professionals to work through faith-based entities within those local communities where they could go to churches, for instance, and have medical physicians there that could administer the vaccine? Because many of our communities are in food deserts and places like that where they can't get the vaccine. That's one question. And the follow-up question to you, Dr. Fauci, is, are there other things we should be telling people about steps they can do to boost their immunity system in addition to the drugs and the vaccine? We're hearing everything. Take steam, get steam in you to eat onions, all kinds of stuff. What are the things that the persons that are listening at us right now, in addition to planning to get the vaccine or taking drugs, that they can do to boost their immune systems?
And let me just add a little bit to that before you answer that, Dr. Fauci, because one of the issues in our community is that people think that the focus is just on medication. So the thought is they're so focused on this vaccine and nobody's talking to us about anything else. So and self-treatment, what do I do at home before I can get the vaccine? So if you would share with us, as Bishop said, if there are any other things that we ought to be saying to people.
Okay, let me just first answer the Bishop's first question. The way we're going to get into the communities that are in both, where there are food deserts, there are also pharmacy deserts. Right. And that is by putting up centers where you can actually have vaccinations by whomever, medical students, nursing students, people who are retirees, because right now, most of the people who are physicians or nurses or healthcare providers are being overwhelmed by sick people. You don't want to pull them away. So there are a lot of other people that can administer an intramuscular injection. You could do it by community centers, churches. You mentioned, Bishop, is very important. Faith-based organizations getting involved, but also mobile units to go out into those communities which are not readily accessible. But in answer to the question that was just asked, first of all, things that are really rather simple, good nutrition, rest, stress reduction, plenty of sleep. It seems rather simplistic. When we talk about things that would boost the immunity, if you have a normal immune system, there are very few things that are going to boost your immunity that have been shown in clinical trials to actually have an enhancement of immunity. Things like rest, diet, lack of stress, or alleviation of stress do more than many of the things that are claimed to boost immunity. One of the things among the so-called vitamin type approaches is that we know from tuberculosis and other disease that vitamin D deficiency is a very important parameter of lack of host defense to fight against certain infections, particularly demonstrated in tuberculosis, but certainly in other diseases. So I don't think you should load up with thousands of units of vitamin D, but you should make sure you're not dealing with a unnoticed vitamin D deficiency. And for that reason, you want to make sure that people are not vitamin D deficient.
I just wanted to say that, especially for those who have underlying conditions, for example, HIV and diabetes, making sure that some of those chronic diseases are very well managed. So people taking their meds, making sure their virus is suppressed is another way. Like Dr. Fauci mentioned, those who are normal, but those who are at risk of being abnormal, controlling the conditions, diabetes, etc. So I think it's critically important. And, in the face of the disruptions to medical care that have occurred with COVID, it becomes even more important for our health systems to pay attention to those who have these conditions and be innovative. We're using a lot of telehealth and telemedicine, for example, to make sure that those who have underlying conditions can have appropriate care during a very difficult and challenging time.
Very good, very good. Dr. Corbett.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one more thing to that is that one of the things that needs to be said in those regards is that keeping your immune system healthy, keeping yourself healthy in general is great all across the board, but it is definitely no surrogate for vaccination and the specific type of immunity that vaccines provide. And so I think that the two need to be separated into real distinct categories. And so one of the reasons why you hear us talking about vaccines is because of the understanding of the specific type of immune responses that vaccines generate that just vitamin D or rest or any other stress relievers, et cetera, will not do.
While I've got you talking, let me follow up with another question. What about fertility? Has there been any consideration to long-term effects on fertility? And should pregnant women have any concerns about taking the vaccine?
No, there have not been any considerations about long-term fertility issues. Part of the reason why there is this, I think, thought that these vaccines might affect fertility is one, because they are messenger RNA vaccine platforms. And because of the knowledge surrounding messenger RNA, the initial thought was that you might be able to affect one's DNA and thus fertility. And that is just simply untrue. Messenger RNA does not affect or alter one's DNA, and nor does it alter your fertility. And so I think that that's just one of the things that has to be said in this regard. The current recommendation is that for women of childbearing age, that they still receive the vaccines. I'm obviously one of those women, and I received my vaccine on December 30th. And also, I don't know the specific numbers, but Dr. Fauci might. Although women were not supposed to get pregnant in the clinical trial, things happen in a pandemic, and some did. Vaccinated women got pregnant in the clinical trial, and no complications arose from those, small subset of women.
So let me just throw one thing in, Bishop, that we often get asked, Kizzy and I often get asked regarding mRNA vaccines. They hear the word RNA, and they say, is this going to do anything to my genes? Is it going to interfere or do something to distort my genes? And the answer to that is absolutely not. No question, case closed, that's it. Because that's such an interesting question they get asked. It's understandable why when people hear RNA, they hear DNA, they hear genes, they want to know if it's going to interfere in some way or get into your genes and change your genetic makeup. Not a chance.
That's good to hear.
Very good to hear.
Very good to hear. Dr. Ogbuagu, there's been limited reports of healthcare workers getting adverse reactions to the vaccine, minor fevers and what have you. What potential side effects or adverse reactions of this vaccine do we need to worry about, or are they all minuscule?
Okay, great. That's a great question. So let me just say that it appears that the real world experience is mirroring mirroring what happened in the clinical trial. So we can say that there's been no surprises, and that's great, because the concern always is that, the numbers that are exposed to a drug in clinical trials is, kind of a finite number, although in phase 3, we're talking of tens of thousands. But when you roll it out to millions, there's always the concern that, rare side effects may pop up, etc. So, like everyone else involved with the vaccine research, I mean, we've also been watching closely to see what now that it's being rolled out in the UK, in the US, and we're talking of millions of people receiving the doses. It's been nice to see that they really just look like the data from clinical trials. So, it falls into two buckets, if you will, local side effects that people can have with the vaccine, as well as systemic side effects. One thing I always parrot out when I do talks around this is, the term we tend to use for some of the early side effects is really reactogenicity, which means it's just people reacting to the vaccine, so that it's not, I feel that, the term side effects tend to always have a negative connotation. And I think that if people, at least for some of the side effects, perceive it as being a response to the vaccine, it's more likely to be viewed in a positive sense. So other than the local, injection site reactions, there are also systemic side effects that do occur. Again, the vast majority of these are mild to moderate degree, happen in the first, few days after the vaccine, and resolve pretty quickly. So I think, based on the at least 2-month experience for these two lead vaccine candidates, the side effects are definitely tolerable. It's something to warn people against, so they know to expect that. And like has been said already, we think that majority of these adverse events will happen very early from vaccination rather than long-term. And it's heartening to see the safety profile so far.
The muscle aches and the fever and things like that are actually paradoxically a good sign, which means your immune system is really responding to the vaccine. So sometimes you get muscle aches and you feel a little down and you get a headache. That's because you probably are inducing an immune response that's letting these proteins that are inflammatory proteins cut loose. It lasts, as was just mentioned, no more than 24 to 36 hours. But even though it's a little bit uncomfortable, it really is telling you that your immune system is working properly to respond to the vaccine.
So, Dr. Fauci, do you have any blunting of the immune response if you take some over-the-counter something to help you with those aches or any of that after the second dose, where most of my colleagues had issues? I've had the vaccine as well. I had my second dose on Friday, and I'm sitting here doing well today. So,
no, I mean, if you take something like Tylenol, it's not going to interfere with an immune response. I'm glad that you use the terminology, Dr. Waggoner, of over-the-counter, because some people are on medications for underlying conditions, such as people with autoimmune diseases who might be on low-dose glucocorticoids, corticosteroids. The chances that doesn't have anything to do with the safety of the vaccine. It has to do with whether or not you're going to get an optimal response if you're on an immunosuppressive drug. We get asked that question all the time, that a lot of people out there have underlying conditions for which they have medications. The only time you have to worry about if you have an immunosuppressed state is if you're dealing with regard to safety with a live attenuated vaccine. But the mRNA vaccines and any of the others are not live attenuated. So you don't need to worry about safety. You may not get an optimal immune response if your immune system is being suppressed medically because of an underlying condition. But that's no reason not to get vaccinated, because even a response that isn't optimal is better than no response at all.
When you start talking about herd immunity, it's my understanding it's going to take about 70 to 85% of the population has to be vaccinated in order for us to achieve herd immunity in this country. The allotment of vaccines, however, that went out recently is only sufficient to inoculate about 2% of the population. When you look at that, late last year, say Pfizer cut its end of the year supply projections by half due to problems with supplies of raw materials. What can be done to mitigate what is apparently shaping up to be a supply crisis?
I don't think it's going to be a supply crisis when you get into February, March, April, May. We'll reach herd immunity. The federal government has contracted for enough vaccine to vaccinate essentially everybody in the country with a prime and a boost, except for the Janssen product, which is only requiring a single dose. So it isn't a question of an ultimate crisis. It's a question of where we are today and tomorrow and next week. Ultimately, we will get to being able to vaccinate. I hope that we achieve that, Bishop, by the mid to end of the summer, because we're going to go through the priority vaccinations through January, February, or March. By the time we get to April, I would hope that it's like open season. Anybody can get the vaccine, whether you're in a priority group or not. And then if we vaccinate people through April, May, June, July, and August, I hope that by the time we get to the fall, if in fact what we're trying to accomplish here today is successful, namely getting people to be vaccinated, we could reach that 70 to 85% of the country by the fall and the end of the summer.
One of my concerns, and I think why fora like this are critically important, is, we talk about general numbers. So for example, with herd immunity, we're talking about the general US population. But if I'm going to predict, is that, especially since we have concern that certain groups or populations may, talk about vaccine hesitancy, my concern is that the coverage will not be uniform and there will be populations left vulnerable to the disease. I'll give an example. We've seen how for measles, for example, very recently, that unvaccinated people, New York, places in the South, et cetera, pockets where people are vulnerable to a disease that they absolutely should not be because there's an available vaccine. So if I were to predict, and I think this is the message to get out to Black and Brown people, is that, certain groups may achieve herd immunity and certain groups may not. And, that will serve to continue to fuel this cycle. So again, just to get the message out, herd immunity really has to be tied to vaccine acceptance. And I think those have to go together.
When you start talking about herd immunity, and you start talking about how nomadic we are, we're traveling all the time, we're intercontinental, we're moving from place to place. It's not like we're going to stay in America and not travel abroad. So when you start talking about herd immunity, are we just talking about America, or are we going to be free to travel?
Well, you could travel. That's one of the reasons why we want everybody to get vaccinated, because if you go to a country in which there is a lot of infection and you're not protected, you certainly are vulnerable to getting infected. We see that with measles. I mean, it was just mentioned right now about measles. So if you are vaccinated against measles and you go to a country in which measles is a prevalent infection, as we see in so many developing nations, and you're protected, you're protected. But if you're not, the fact that there's herd immunity in the United States as a nation, that 85% of the people are vaccinated, and you're not vaccinated, you're not protected when you go out of the country and go to a place where there's a lot of infection. Herd immunity means that in the place where you are, the virus has no place to go because most of the people are protected. But if you're not vaccinated and you get on a plane and go to a country where there's a lot of COVID-19 going on, you got a big problem. And that's the reason why we're encouraging people, particularly the vulnerable people in the African-American community, to get vaccinated, because you want to protect yourself and your family and your entire community. And you could do that. It's a personal responsibility and a community responsibility, because the more people that get vaccinated in your community, the less chance the virus has to circulate in your community.
When you talk about that, you really set up what I was getting ready to ask you. A lot of emphasis has been placed on black and brown people because of our predisposition to be affected adversely by the virus. When it comes to vaccination, why is it in the interest of the general public at large that people of color be vaccinated? How does that affect other people group in the United States?
Well, I mean, I don't want to be answering all the questions, but the fact is that we're all in this together. That's the point. If you want to protect the entire country, you've got to get the entire country vaccinated to a very, very high degree. But if part of a community. And we saw this absolutely clear in the Orthodox Jewish community in New York City and the upper part of New York City and Larchmont and New Rochelle, that those individuals did not get vaccinated. So even though the rest of the country was above the critical level of herd immunity, that community got devastated by measles because they had such a low level within their own community. So that's the reason why we are, in many respects, all of us are pleading with the brown and black people to please get vaccinated for your own safety and for your community's safety.
Dr. Corbett, you have done a lot of work with vaccine awareness, just trying to help people understand and work with the anti-vaxxers and those kinds of people. What do you say to people to help them understand that, for instance, if they get the vaccine, it's not going to give them the disease?
Well, just taking that question back a little bit, one of the things that I think is very important is that you just listen to people. So I try not to say anything to anyone unless I'm asked, because I find that people's inquiries around the vaccine are fairly specific to their own personal story, to their own personal community, their community story, etc. And so the more that you listen, the more you can gauge what really needs to be said to a particular person around their vaccine hesitancy. In regards to not catching the virus from the vaccine, this vaccine only takes a mRNA shot of one particular protein from coronavirus. This protein does not have the ability to replicate like a virus. It has no other components of the coronavirus. It is simply one specific protein. And it's the protein that we've been studying at the NIAID for several years and trying to understand it in a large amount of detail. And so you cannot get sick from this one particular protein. It is not going to give you the virus. You can't pass this protein on to anyone else. It basically just alerts your immune system of what the protein looks like, so that your immune system essentially takes a snapshot of it, so that when it appears again to your body by way of the virus, and your body says, oh, I've seen this protein before, let me go fight against it.
Excellent.
So it doesn't even contain the information that could make you ill?
Absolutely not. Right.
That's something we're not hearing enough of. I think that's a very important thing that will help to dispel a lot of fears and a lot of myths. I don't want to take advantage of your time. I know all of you are very, very busy, but I did want to ask Dr. Corbett this final question. You've been getting a lot of visibility as an epidemiologist in your work with coming up with the vaccine and what have you. There has been a great divide amongst African American men and women going into science, technology, and what have you, yet there is an influx of people who are expressing interest in that. What would you say to young black girls and boys who are considering a career that would encourage them to fill in the huge divide that exists in our community? We have a tendency to go to doctors who look like us. How can we get more people involved?
The first step really is to just go for it. So I actually started working at Dr. Fauci's institute when I was only 18 years old, which was way back when. But really at that point, I had no idea what a career in science really entailed. I didn't even know how to be a scientist or do anything in the lab. But under a program in the institute, I was allowed to go to the lab and be an intern. And so the more you get your feet wet early on and start to discover the things that you like and the things that you don't like around any career path, I think is beneficial for us all. Science is one of those career choices where the glory often is unseen, right? Because without this pandemic, the truth of the matter is I would still just be in the lab studying coronavirus spike proteins, and vaccine development might come, but it might not, right? And so you have to understand that as a young person going in, that the glory is really a lot of times internal around discovery and understanding how the world turns. For me, that makes me really excited. And if that's something that could make you excited, then I think it's a career path that you might that you might take a liking to.
That's exciting. One other thing, I know I said that other was the last one. This is the real last one. As I was leaving the house today, there was new updated information about new strands. There's been one, now there are multiple new strands coming out. Are there any strands that you see on the horizon that threaten the efficacy of this vaccine as it relates to COVID-19?
Right now, the data do not indicate that the mutations that are being studied right now, both in the UK, which has spread to other countries, in South Africa, interfere with the efficacy of the antibodies that are induced by the currently used vaccines. However, this is something we need to keep our eye out on, and that's the reason why we take mutations very seriously and we study them very seriously. Now, it's much more likely that a mutation would block the effect of a monoclonal antibody that's against one particular component of the spike protein. But when you get vaccinated, you get multiple polyclonal antibodies against all different parts. So it's less likely that it would interfere with the effect of a vaccine than it would with the effect of an individual monoclonal antibody. Having said that, it looks good for now, but we want to make sure we keep following it very, very carefully.
One question that I think is important to get out here. This vaccine, is it once and for all, or will we have to take it annually, or will we have to take it every 10 years? Do you foresee in your crystal ball that this is a one-time thing, or will we have to do it annually and redevelop it and re-enhance it as new strands emerge?
So there's two variables here. One is the duration or the durability of the immunity that the vaccines produce, which is still under study. Some of the phase 3 trials were designed to go for 2 years, and that data is actively being collected. I know at the time that the data was submitted to the FDA, we already had robust 2-month data suggesting that they were at least preserved, almost parallel. And I think the current expectation that it should probably last a couple of years. That said, the second variable is the virus changing. And I think this ties into what you mentioned about the mutations in the virus and the different strains that are emerging. For now, up till recently, the virus was mutating slowly. And so we're super confident that that won't be an issue. But the reason why the more recent strains have brought to attention is that it appeared to have changed at a pace that was rather quick in the more recent period. So we'll keep an eye on the virus. It appears the immunity from the vaccine will definitely do so much better than the duration of natural immunity. I'll put it out there. So that's where we are. We already have circulating coronaviruses that occur seasonally, which means every year, like the flu, they circulate as well. So there's chance that this virus may do the same, or it may fizzle out. But for now, some of that data is still emerging.
For the last few moments, you've been listening to Conversations with America, Unpacking the COVID-19 Vaccine. I want to thank again my special guests, Dr. Kizzy Corbett, Dr. Ogbuagu, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and my co-host, Dr. Jill Waggoner, for contributing to our deeper understanding as we forge forward to fight this pandemic and understand more about the vaccine. I hope this information has been helpful to you. I'm Bishop T.D. Jakes, the senior pastor of the Potter's House, and you're listening to Conversations with America.